We'll get on with and welcome to the Strategy, Finance and Risk Committee meeting on Monday the 16th of August 2021 on a perfect day here in Tauranga, Moana. In terms of health and safety, if the alarm sounds, please make your way to the nearest emergency exit down the stairs next to the lift. Our assembly point is the car park at the rear of the building, and we wait there for the all clear to re-enter. Mobility impaired people, please wait in the lift lobby as the designated place of safety, and when the fire service will be notified. Please don't anyone use the lift during an emergency evacuation. Everyone will be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and the video is publicly available on YouTube. Can I just remind members please to speak clearly into your microphones and one at a time, and turn it off when you've finished. And can everyone turn their mobile phones off or onto silent for us, please? And who's going to open with a karakia? Pia? Thank you.
Ai, Marina tātou katoa. Nā mihi nei kia tātou kua tau kei raro te tūnui o tēnei whare kia tātou nei. Ka tukuna nei ki tēnei inu atu nei I tā tātou nei matunui te rangi hei ara I hoki nā I nā kaupapa kei wanganu ki a tātou. Nō reira tēnā tātou, ka inui. E pāto matunui tēnei hoki rā ki a mātanui I tēnei ata. Tukuna nei ki tēnei inu atu nei ki a koe. Tō manaakitanga ki runga I tā tātou nei whānau. Ara hoki nei I nā whānau pani te maha hoki nei ki a rātou nei. E noho pani ana ki a rātou nei ki nā kāinga maha ki Tauranga mōna, whiti atu rā I nā kāinga maha ki te motu. Manaki anō hoki rā e pā I tā tātou nei kuia krau e noho nei ka rātou nei, ka wanganui ki konei. Ara hoki nei I tā tātou nei hāpori ki a tātou nei kua tai ki tēnei huihuinga. Nō reire te atua tēnei ki a mātou nei inu atu ki a koe kararo ki tingo tō maiti a I ukraiti mona wā ake tōna atu. Āmine.
Thank you very much. Any apologies? I think we're all here. We have no one here for the public forum. We have any late items? Don't have any late items. No confidential business to be transferred into the open? No. No change to the order of business I've been aware of. So that brings us to the minutes of the last meeting held on the 28th of June 2021. Does anyone have any corrections they wish to make to that? Someone like to move that we confirm them as a true and correct record? Shad and Stephen. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Declarations of conflict, please. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Not a conflict as such, but on item 9.7, I prepared an individual submission on the RMA reform proposal, so just so that other members are aware. I've got an interest in that area, but I don't believe it's a conflict.
Madam Chair, I also just want to make it clear that in terms of 9.2, I'm currently employed by Tauranga City Council as the Tangata Whenua Engagement Facilitator.
Just in regards to 9.7, the submission on the NBA, I'm also providing advice and support to MFE and ministers.
Marina tātou, again similar to Shadrach, 9.7, conflicted on that matter or any matter relating to the Natural and Built Environment Bill as an employee of the Ministry for the Environment. Kia ora.
Yeah, sorry again. Just in relation to any submission relating to smart growth, in terms of the Infrastructure Accelerated Fund, that I'm also the Pauarahi Tupaketi advisor.
Thank you very much, everybody. So, we've made a note of all of those. Thank you. That brings us to the business today, 9.1, amendments to the use of toxic agrochemicals for vegetation management policy. And I think we've got Emma, is it Emma coming? And we've also got our forum representatives. I think would probably be easier if we bring you all up to the table. And yeah, we'll start with the staff and then the forum. Oh, my goodness, I hope it doesn't look too healthy. So if we start with the staff's report and then we'll hear from TAF and then we'll have a discussion. Thank you, Emma.
Morena, everybody. So this is a report, small review of our use of toxic agrochemicals for vegetation management policy. This review was triggered late last year when we had a request from the Toxic Agrochemicals Advisory Forum, which was supported by staff to have a review of the policy. So we met with TAF earlier this year and talked through what might be some issues we'd like to consider through a policy review. And we came to the conclusion that a full policy review, considering things like whether we should have a policy, whether our policy should still have a very strong precautionary nature, that perhaps this wasn't necessary and the policy remained fit for purpose overall. However, from a staff perspective, there were a couple of points in the policy that we would like to see, that we're recommending be amended just to improve the operational efficiency of the policy. That's particularly with regards to the signage rules. And the other issue that we'd like to see changed is how we add or delete agrochemicals from the Schedule 1. So those are a couple of the recommendations we're making. There are others as well. So we've written the report and TAF have had some insights and they've provided some comments on the report and provided that feedback as an attachment. But I also understand they have a presentation and they'd like to give you that feedback as well. So happy to take any questions or we can wait for the presentation.
Thank you very much. I think it might be helpful, but I'm happy to be guided, but what I propose is that we take TAF's presentation now and then come back with questions. Kia ora. Nice to have you with us.
Okay, can you hear me okay? I'm Morena koutou, and thank you for the opportunity. And thank you to Emma for her hard work on the review of the policy. I'm here with two members of TAF sitting beside me. There are 3 more. I think our numbers do change a little as time passes, who were unable to make it today, but they've had input into the comments being made here. Just a very quick reminder, because I know that the commissioners have already been through this, but there are other people present. The objectives of TAF are to protect public health, to represent the community on the use of toxic agrochemicals by Tauranga City Council, to provide consultation to the council on the use of toxic agrochemicals, and in particular in relation to any proposal to use new chemicals. TAF is always consulted and generally provides significant input to our proposal. And lastly, our primary objective is to reduce use of toxic agrochemicals in the Tauranga environment. And on all of these things we have some success, but we are not always entirely successful. Now, we agreed with the City Council that a full policy review was unnecessary. In fact, the policy was reviewed back in 2014, and at that time also it was not changed in any major way. So the current policy seems to be working reasonably well. Just a quick comment, a comment that I've taken out of the report. And there's a comment in there, we're not quite sure why it's there or what its purpose was, but I just wanted to point a couple of things out about it. First, in terms of its grammar, to identify any areas where the policy was not achieving its objective to protect public health or impacting on council's ability. If you put a comma before the or, then you remove the ambiguity that's in that sentence, because it's unclear whether the objective is to protect public health or whether it's both of those things. So the second part of though is the part that we find just a little bit confrontational, because there's absolutely no doubt that TAF has impact on council's ability to undertake vegetation management and weed control. There is no question. There never has been. In fact, the purpose of TAF is to do that. Not obviously as an objective, but our role is to effectively provide a conscience for council on the process of using herbicides and pesticides. So there is no question we do that, so we don't know why that comment is there. And we worry that council thinks that we are interfering with council's ability to do things and that this might be a bad thing, because that's the implication of that statement. So just a little bit concerned about the implication. And in terms of public health issues, these obviously are very difficult to explore, to gather data on, and in reality nobody is really doing that, including TAF. We comment on it, but we do not have any direct input into it, and neither does council in any immediate way. Now, in the report, you will find on page 27.10, there are 5 items listed. So page 27.10, first item, it's the first one in the report, and I've pulled it out for you. Allowing products to be added to Schedule 1 where staff and TAF are in agreement without seeking council approval. This has, the requirement to get formal approval has created problems for the addition of agrochemicals to the Schedule 1. So where everybody thinks it's a good idea, for example, somebody might propose an organic herbicide or a herbicide with a clearly lower level of toxicity to be used in the context where a highly toxic agrochemical is used. What we're trying to do is stop them from going through the complex and time-consuming process of getting approval. In other words, if we all agree, then let's just give it the tick and put it on the schedule. So we're in agreement with that one. However, there is the possibility that TAF and staff will disagree, and our view is that TAF should then provide advice in the usual way associated with any new application for adding a chemical, and therefore the final decision would rest with the councillors, or in the current case, the commissioners. The recommendation from staff is that then that decision should be handed over to an operational manager such as the CEO, and TAF disagrees with that suggestion. I have thrown in a few pictures. This is a pretty bland and dull presentation. The pictures are there just to give you some entertainment, but also to tell you a little bit about what other people in other parts of the world do. So this picture was taken in the Netherlands. In fact, I think all of them may be. And that fountain is not there for show or for beautification. That fountain is there to oxygenate the water and stop weed growth. And as a result, the cost to council of managing weed growth in that pond is reduced by, I don't know how much, let's say half, even 3/4. Just running that council, which is an energy investment and maintenance, presumably, makes a huge difference to the costs for council. Those daffodils are not just there for show. That's the place where here you will find a brown strip from glyphosate, from Roundup or some version of glyphosate. There, it's planted in daffodils. And eventually the daffodils will die back, and eventually the grass will grow up, and something else will happen. They'll mow it. What they will never do is spray it. Now, this is a more controversial issue, and it's probably the one that needs the most discussion. Providing for trials of new products without going through the complex Schedule 1 process, the idea being that we need to find out if it works in the current environment. So it's some kind of a new product, or somebody's discovered it, or somebody believes that it will work. Let's go out there and trial it and see. That sounds very simple, but the reality is it's not simple. And the problem is how you actually go about doing it, because it's not good enough to go, okay, let's take a small area, go out and use our spray and see if the stuff that we're targeting dies. That's not a trial. It's almost certainly going to die because it says so right there on the label. This stuff kills those things. If it doesn't die, we would all be amazed. So there has to be a much higher quality of reporting for a trial, and that's where the problems start to arise. How do you design the trial? Well, the trial should be designed as an experiment. How should we report the trial? That's a very difficult question to answer because some of the people who are going to do this won't have the appropriate skills or won't have the available time to do that kind of reporting. So what we're concerned about is that the trials could provide a loophole enabling use of products that are not currently on Schedule 1 and potentially for extended periods. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened with the current trials of oxadiazone. Now, Emma almost certainly will disagree with me on this, and that's fine. There is no question, though, that the time frame of the oxadiazone trials has been extended. And Emma has also just suggested that a change be made to the comments about oxadione in Schedule 1, and she wants to delete reference to the financial year. This is the loophole. Because if that simply gets deleted, that's the limitation that creates the end of the oxadiazone trial. Take that out, and we can go on trialing oxadiazone and Lynx Avenue for the rest of our lives, if we wish. Now, presumably, we will have other sorts of controls on that, but I don't know what they are. TAF doesn't know what they are at this stage. So that's something that needs to be discussed. Oh, no picture on that one, sorry. I didn't put in too many pictures, I'd get distracted. So, in terms of trials, we have developed a proposed methodology, and we are still discussing that methodology. So it hasn't gone before TAF, so we haven't brought it to council yet. And when we have an agreed version, we'll start discussing it with Emma. And if you look in that third dot point, there are requirements for monitoring, data capture, reporting, and time frame. They all need to be defined because this would be a proper experiment. But defining all of those things could actually result in the trial never going ahead because of the cost, because of the management, and because of the skills needed to run that trial. So it's quite possible that trials acceptable to TAF, particularly when we look at that draft methodology, will not be acceptable to council because of the reporting and monitoring requirements. But that's up for discussion. Now, signage is and always has been a controversial issue. I've been on TAF for more than 10 years, and there has never been a year when signage does not come up as a big issue because somebody wants to change something. And I want to start with a very, very quick anecdote because it lays out the effects of the proposal that council has put forward as the alternative to the current signage rules. I was in Mokoroa recently cycling through a park. In that park, there was a team who were spraying. When I came around a corner, the guy spraying stopped his spraying so that I could go by, but he immediately started spraying again. I had passed a handwritten sign about 100 meters before. An hour later, I came back. That sign was gone, the guy was gone, and there were people and dogs running through the areas that had been sprayed. Now, was it dry? Is being dry enough after 1 hour for those people and their dogs to be running through that spray? That team was working to the current regional council rules, which is what has been proposed for signage within the Tauranga City Council. TAF has always argued that rules like that are A, too loose, and B, too short to do the job. The job is to protect public health. We need to notify people of what's happening when you use agrochemicals and where it's happening, and putting up a sign while you're actually doing it is almost unnecessary because I wasn't stopped from riding right by the guy doing the spraying. He did stop his spraying for a few moments, but the sign didn't stop me. In fact, it was handwritten and I could barely read it as I went by. But more importantly, taking that sign away when the toxin is barely dried just seems an inappropriate way of managing the environmental use of something that's quite toxic. So, we do not believe that the Regional Council rules, which are proposed to be used, will do the job. We believe that the rules that we currently have in place do the job in a possibly not quite optimal way, because they're not optimal for contractors, but they are what the public needs in order to protect public health. Oh, and here's another pretty picture for you. In terms of notification, TAF prefers that the status quo remain in place. The proposal to notify spray events through the council website may satisfy all of the current rules, but we do not believe that most people will ever know that there is spraying to be done in their area, because most people do not spend much time on council website. Now, I'm interested in council. I don't spend much time on council website, and most people I know have never even heard of the council website. So it's not a great place to be notifying. The picture, council planted those flowers. And while these are spring flowers, they're crocuses, they come up, they create beautification. They're not wild. They've been planted by the council, they're maintained and managed by the council. Those flowers cause the grass not to be mown, but the people who live there think they're wonderful. And as a result, the grass can be allowed to grow a lot longer, because we don't mow the grass while the flowers are out. It's a very simple way of convincing the locals that you don't need to create a beautiful billiard table of grass every day of their lives. Okay, use of the word toxic. Staff have recommended that the word toxic be removed, because it is both redundant and maybe a little inflammatory. It's emotional. That's your word? Emotive or emotional? Yeah. And there's no question. We agree. It is emotional, it is inflammatory, and that's why it needs to be there. And TAF do not want that word removed. We think that it is absolutely relevant to the issue that we're confronting, which is the use of toxic agrochemicals. Funnily enough, council does not bring use of detergents, use of fertilizers, use of other chemicals which might or might not be used in an agrochemical context, and which might or might not be a little bit toxic. They don't come to TAF for approval. They're not on Schedule 1. So I'm not sure where you draw the line, but the point is that TAF deals with chemicals in our environment that are toxic. And if you take out the word toxic, things could become very confusing, and certainly TAF's framework could become quite confusing. So we're there to protect public health from toxic agrochemicals because they are used as toxins. That's the end of the presentation. Just this one to reinforce the concept that you don't have to create billiard tables. These plants, now for some reason the name of the plant slipped my mind, really stupid, because dandelion. These dandelions are often sprayed in certain places. They are often removed by many people. Certainly, if you want to get rid of them, Roundup is a great way to do it. And what do you know? If you don't do it, you get this kind of beauty. You get those things which we know. Every one of us who's ever had a child loves to play with those things. But if you mow that lawn every 10 days, you won't get them. So that kind of beauty is a part of how you convince your community to accept that you can let the grass grow longer and you can let it be more diverse. And the key issue there is actually not so much the longer grass, it's the diversity within the grass. It's creating an environment that is biodiverse, which is friendly, which can be fun to play in if you just make small changes to your mindset. And which in fact, and I'll just throw this one in, can actually be used to control things like onehunga weed. Longer grass, there is no question, longer grass controls onehunga weed. That's all from TAF. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Also helps to tell the time, doesn't it? Dandelions. Okay, so questions. Questions. I have a question. I'm happy to start. No, Bill, go.
Thanks, Chair. This is probably to Emma. In terms, and on pages 29 and 30 of the agenda, so we're in 2.1.1, and there's a description of the option, and then 2.12, there's the description of the same option, but with the addition and human health effects. So staff are recommending not to include and human health effects. Yet going back to your report under background in 5, the primary objective of the policy is to protect the public health of Tauranga residents. So I'd just like some commentary on that particular matter. It just seems to be at odds with the objective of the policy in terms of that those options at 2.1.1 and 2.1.2.
Thank you. Opportunity to comment on that. So the main reason for not recommending that consideration of human health effects is councils are not specifically set up to do that work. That work is generally done by the Environmental Protection Agency. So we've just decided that that's the best option for council, in that EPA should have already considered those human health effects, and we wouldn't be recommending any product for a trial that has not already been approved for use in New Zealand. The cost of doing human health trials may be quite outside of our remit and quite costly.
I suppose a supplementary, though, in terms of the objective of the policy is to protect public health. So I'm still at a bit of a loss in terms of the primary objective, and then you're saying, well, the EPA does that, and I understand that, but is that not a consideration, though, in the overall matter of the use of agrochemicals?
Correct. So obviously that is the primary objective of the policy, but when we would like to be doing trials, it's generally to consider the other objectives, which is to ensure that we have effective vegetation management, and that's the main reason we'd be looking to do a trial. So that is why we're sort of focusing on that objective, and then as part of that we would have considered what the EPA is saying about that particular product, and that would meet our human health requirements.
So that leads nicely into my question, which is sort of based on what TAF has said. Are we better, when we come to the trials, are we better to go through the process of defining what a trial actually looks like? Because I do take the point that it can mean a whole lot of different things to different people. So if we have it defined with a process and a methodology and a time limit and the objectives clearly defined, wouldn't that give you more confidence then, and more cover off those wider issues that TAF are raising?
Through you, Chair, one of the recommendations is that TAF would always have input into a trial, so we would work together to identify at the time we'd like to do a trial what the objectives, the parameters and the timeframes would be, and that's the recommendation that we have to include in the policy, because it does provide some flexibility for us to discuss with TAF what that trial might look like, and then we would come together and to reach that agreement rather than being quite specific in the policy. So TAF mentioned that they're looking at what they would like to see in a trial, and that gives us kind of like almost a procedure that we can work with TAF on when we are developing a trial. So that's in the policy. We're quite happy just to say, hey, TAF, we're going to have some input into those objectives and parameters and timeframes, and we'll work with you to look at what that might be for each particular product that we may wish to trial.
No, I mean, I understand that for each product it will be different, or it could be different. So their objection over the Links AV, is that more because there were a hold up in getting it done, and that it was agreed for a certain period of time, is the trial finished, or is the intention that if the trial was only to be during a financial year, that indicates a 12-month time, that you would be putting a 12-month finish on the Links Ave?
Yeah, if I may, I'd just like to introduce to you to Pete Mouldy from Spaces and Places. He can talk to the trial a bit more than I can.
Marina, everybody. Just in regards to the trials for the oxidizon, initially we were given permission to grow a new sports turf at Blake Park and Ocean Downs Reserve. There was a delay in timing of the development of Ocean Downs Reserve, so that extended the time period. Following the first two trials, we sought permission and we consulted with TAF about undertaking the same trial at Links Ave Reserve, where we were growing in another new turf. So for every trial, essentially we start the grow-in period at the beginning of summer, and the whole area is fenced off, and that's basically to keep people off while the turf establishes and becomes resilient. But during that process, that's when we're undertaking testing, and really our testing is set out to confirm the product is behaving as it was stating on the label given by the supplier. So that's as far as we can go in terms of testing.
Come back to TAF and then ask on that recommendation that is looking to allow the oxidisation to be used on Links Ave Reserve. Does that meet your concerns? The fact that it is a trial that you'd already been involved in agreeing to, but it was delayed, which means the timing of it moved into a separate financial year.
Yes, TAF was consulted. I mean, there was a process that we all went through. It was all agreed. So our point is not about that example as a specific problem. There is no specific problem there, although we don't know when the oxidizon trial will actually end or how it will be reported. I don't know to what extent that's been agreed, but you can comment on that. So I raised that as an example of the kind of consequence when you introduce trials as an option. Because what's happening now is we have oxidizon being used in 3 different parks, I believe. Am I correct? And I do not believe there is a control. Am I correct? Where's the place that you're monitoring in the same way where you did not use oxidizon?
That is part of the trial. We grew in a turf on one field, a new turf. There's other fields right next door, so we used that as the trial, the test site.
And
So we took samples from there as well as we were using the product. The trial finishes when the grow-in is complete and all the fences come down. So all the trials are finished.
So, I mean, we don't have any issue with that specific example. Our issue is with the bigger picture. What is a trial? How do you define its parameters? When does it end? What happens when somebody needs to extend it? Are there, will we be able to define rules for doing that? The simplest solution to this is let's not have trials, you see? Thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, just to clarify my point of view, so it would be advantageous to try and define trial, though, wouldn't it? Exactly. I'm following from the chair's earlier comments. To me, it would be hugely advantageous if you could get together and try and flesh out what the definition and how the trials are conducted, and it would give everyone more certainty. That would be my take on this.
TAF's initial response to the concept of a trial was, it'll never work, it's a loophole, and so on. However, Emma talked us around, or maybe we talked ourselves around, I'm not sure, using exactly the points that you're making. That clearly there is value in having trials. So that we have now reached the point where the difficulties are in defining the frameworks of trials, how to run a trial. And so I got given the job of trying to write out it would, I guess, become part of the policy, but a methodology for running a trial. And of course it has to be extremely loose, because every trial will be different. There's no question about that. And so there will have to be some agreement. So then, then it starts to get complicated, but that's okay. We've come up with a concept. We're going to put it before Emma as soon as we've all had a chance to look at it and agree on it, and we'll take it from there, following exactly the points that you're making.
So if in recommendation 8, where the staff are recommending that we revise Schedule 1 to allow oxodiazone, is that how you pronounce it? Oxodiazone? To be used on Lynx Avenue. If we add in after that a methodology be agreed for the use of trials, would you both be happy with that?
Through you, Madam Chair. Just to note that, as Pete mentioned, that trial has concluded, so we probably can just delete that recommendation altogether. Yeah, this report was postponed for a while. So, and the other recommendation I'd just like to draw your attention to is recommendation 4, which is the one saying that TAF will have input into any trials, and that will be when we can have that opportunity to negotiate with the framework that they've put together and develop something together.
TAF happy that the recommendation 4 covers that, which requires TAF to provide input into the objectives, parameters and timeframes for any trial of a new agrochemical.
Yes, TAF is happy with that.
Okay, so any further questions? Shad.
I've just got a question about the signage, and it's probably just a matter of clarification. So at the moment, signs are out for 48 hours, and the new proposal is to reduce that to 24.
Through you, Chair, it's at the moment our policy requires 48 hours after application as a minimum, so they could be out for longer. The new requirement, new recommendation from the Regional Council, if we follow those rules, so at the moment we do more than is required. The Regional Council only requires the signs to be in place while the agrochemical is being used, and then until it is dry or it is no longer present, as I understand it. But Warren Aiken from Parks is here, and he might be able to answer if you've got any more specific questions.
And just on that, just thinking about, so what is the primary concern about the length of time? I know in the report it talks about efficiency, but at some point the contractor will need to remove the sign, whether it's after 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever time period. I'm just wanting to get a handle on what the primary issue is.
If possible, can Warren answer that question? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, the issue that we have is signage is to be out for 48 hours. The maximum that we have in our contracts is for 5 days. So when you've got contractors that are spraying and they're moving on, it actually requires someone to go around and retrieve all those signs. And when signs are out for 5 days, it does create an illusion, I suppose, that we're doing a lot more spraying than what we actually are.
I suppose that would be for the contract in terms of their program. So, given guidance on particular agrochemicals and timeframes of how long signs need to be up and excluding public, I suppose I don't quite understand. At some point, the contractor does need to go back and collect the sign and remove the sign. So whether that's after 24 hours, 48 hours, a week, or whatever, it needs to be done. So I'm just struggling with the reason for the efficiency when contractors do need to remove signs.
Through the chair. If a contractor is working in a specific area and they're working there all day to applying agrochemical along, say, the dunes, so they cover a lot of area, they're still in that area and they can go back if this is adopted, to remove the signs while they're there, rather than then going off to another area and then having to come back and remove them.
What I suggest we do is take the recommendations one by one, because so thank you for that. So if we look at, is someone prepared to move that we receive the amendments? That's just receiving them, and then yeah, well, let's do A. Bill. And Bruce, all those in favour say aye. Against, carried. So then B1, which is to replace the current provision requiring council to approve amendments to Schedule 1, that where staff and TAF agree, it can be made. So is someone prepared to move that? It doesn't have to come to council for agreement where the two, Shad and Rahania. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Carried. So then that brings us to B2, which adds a provision. Oh, so that, yeah, so where they disagree, sorry, the proposal from staff is, the recommendation from staff is that it goes to the CE. I'm happy to move that it comes to council. Where they disagree, I think council should be making the decision. I'm happy to move that. Bill, you're going to second that? Any discussion on that? All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Then we come to 3, which is allowing provision for trials as long as to determine efficiency. We probably take 3 and 4 together. So 1, adding a provision to allow trials, and 2, requiring TAF to provide input into what those trials might be. Wayne, you happy to move those 2? Seconder? Stephen? Any discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. That brings us to signage, and the recommendation from staff is that we delete references to all signage provisions except a statement noting compliance with regional air rules. What's people's bill?
Chair, I'd like to amend that in terms of the signage being in place for the 48 hours after spraying, or whatever the tweet wording would be.
Do you want to retain current provisions? Yep. Yeah, okay. So you're happy to move that we retain the current provisions around signage, and Wayne's seconding that. Any discussion on that? All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. What about deleting references to toxic from the policy? All right, I move that we don't, that we retain the name. Someone happy to second that? Rahania? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. And then revising the layout of Schedule 1 as we've got, so that the common product name is provided as a reference. I don't think TAF made any comment on that. Oh, did they? You supported it?
We support that.
Okay. Someone happy to move? Bill's happy to move. Stephen second. Any discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. And then 8 is withdrawn. Thank you very much, and thank you, TAF, for not only your input today, but for the work that you do on behalf of the community. Thank you. Wayne. So that brings us to item number 9.2, RMA issues and options for the Tauranga City Plan. Janine is here. Is Andy coming up too? Yep. Morena?
Marina tātou. The purpose of this paper is to endorse the resource management issues and options that we have been considering through the Tauranga City Plan. Towards the end of last year, we undertook a workshop with councillors to identify key issues, and earlier in the year, over March and April, we also undertook key stakeholder workshops. We had a series of 3 workshops where we invited our key stakeholders to raise really any key issues with the Tauranga City Plan, and that's down from a rule not working, but to those kind of bigger key issues that they considered that the City Plan should consider. And we also had hui, we had 2 hui with our tangata whenua, so all our iwi and hapu reps, and Tarangapu reps as well, so we had a really good turnout and did the same kind of process. And so bringing all that together, that's where we prepared our key issues and started to consider what the options are to address those key issues. So some of those options may not be a city plan that we've considered, and so those have been laid out in appendix or attachment 2. As an example, we've also also that's attachment 1, and in attachment 2 we've also given an example of kind of the thought process and the thinking that staff have gone through. So while attachment 1 is a pretty brief in terms of very short and to the point in terms of what the key issue is and what the options are, there's quite a bit of thinking that's gone in behind it. There's been research of other councils and how they've progressed it, and or how they may have approached it, and also looking at international examples. So these options have also been taken back to our key stakeholders and to our tangata whenua to kind of confirm those options with them, that they're comfortable, which they are. And the next process is we are now in the process of preparing discussion documents. So across those kind of key themes of managing growth, our built environment, the natural environment, climate change and cultural heritage, we are preparing discussion documents that steps the reader through the kind of the strategic context, what we know, and then also those key issues and options which we'll be seeking feedback on. So in Chambers today we also have David Fizzackley in the room. So David Fizzackley is contracted as a technical director to the City Plan, and has been doing some significant input with staff to get these discussion documents together. The next process is, once we get endorsement from the committee today, is that we will look to finalise those discussion documents, set up a survey, and then we intend to go out for wider community consultation on the issues and options. Bringing that back, we'll bring that back to this committee seeking direction on next steps. So as we're all aware, we're a bit uncertain still with our city plan review. But in any case, we see that this consultation and this work is still really important. That has also been supported by central government. They've said you should still be understanding your issues and options to resolve, but it's still unclear of whether we will be progressing this piece of work through the full review, or whether we'll be coming back and seeking direction in terms of priority plan changes. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Very, very good work that you're doing. Can I confess to a pet hate? And that is in a report being told that you've been working with stakeholders and no mention of who they are. So, it's a very broad term. So I'd like to know who the stakeholders are that you have been consulting in the past and who you intend to consult with in the future.
Fair point. It's very broad. So in terms of our key stakeholders, we have a list of key stakeholders that we've really been building over the years. So when we do any of our consultation and also connections with other parts of the organisation, we have a list of all our key stakeholders. So when I talk about key stakeholders, I'm talking about our central government partners, so Ministry for the Environment, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, as well as Kāinga Ora, going to our council partners, so Western Bay and Regional Council have come along to both our key stakeholder engagement, but they've come to our tangata whenua engagement as well, which has been really great. We have groups like Greater Tauranga, we have Tauranga, we have, so there's environmental groups that come along. We send it out to all of our property developers forum, our housing affordability forums, all of our forums of smart growth. So it's a pretty far-reaching. The list is of what we call key stakeholder groups is almost at 100. So from that, we have probably had attendance spanning the environmental sustainability right through to our property developers of 30 to 40 people that attend each workshop. Which has been really good to have those, I suppose, different points of view. When it comes to our tangata whenua engagement, again, it's quite broad. It's all of our contacts, so we've gone out to, obviously, all of our reps and alternatives of the Tarangapu, all of our RMU reps and those alternatives, and we've also gone out to contacts we have in terms of Māori land trusts, because one of the key issues that we've identified is what role that the city plan plays in providing and enabling aspirations on Māori land, and that's why we've also gone out to land trusts.
Do you include master builders and certified builders in that?
Yes, so we do have, and also the Architects Institute, your, house and land package groups, and as well as groups like our tiny home groups, so all of them are included. So it's really anyone who's had a contact with us at council within this space, they're added to our list. So and anyone can ask to be added to the list, so it's not exclusive, it's just trying to reach those people who are really interested in the city plan and want to be involved in its kind of how it progresses over the next couple of years.
Any further questions? Bill? Shad? Planners, obviously. Yes.
Thank you. Clarification, Janine, in terms of the attachment 2, where you talk about you tease out the thinking in terms of housing affordability. So do I take it that there will be that type of document that will then support each of those key issues at that general level of detail?
Correct. So every single key issue that you see here in options, it's got a supporting paper that sits in behind it. I'm going to be honest, housing affordability is probably one of our bigger issues, and so it's a bit bigger. But yeah, it depends on what the key issue is. When it comes to the discussion document, there is, as I said, that upfront part. The key issues are probably a little bit briefer than this, but they've still got all of that thinking and examples in behind.
Okay, no, and thanks for that. Just why I think of it in terms of that housing affordability issue would be quite helpful in terms of some reference to that smart growth housing spectrum that covers all the 6 or 7 segments in terms of that spectrum. And also probably a bit more discussion in terms of whilst the market-led housing essentially looks after itself, notwithstanding in terms of the prices of that, but more around that social and affordable, because I think that would be helpful, and that was messaging we got through the LTP process. So be that as it may, in terms of then when I go to on page 54 and the commercial hierarchy and centres, and in the last column inclusive centre zones in terms of a strong centres based policy, so I take it that there would be a much fuller description of what that involves, and would that include examples? For example, Hamilton City have a very strong policy in that space.
Yes, so in where we do have examples, we will use them. There is, I'll be honest, in terms of the discussion documents, we've elaborated a little bit in terms of what those options look like, but not a huge amount. But where we're trying to get to is making it clear with a lot of the options, it's on the spectrum how far you take it from that enabling to mandating or really strong policy direction. But yeah, there is some explanation, and where there are examples, we can include them.
Yeah, it's just the ability for people to understand, and whilst the planning fraternity and others might understand what a strong centres-based policy is, I suspect a whole lot of people won't. So it's just making sure there is that description.
Yep.
And then below that, industrial land, and number 2, talking about a spatial application of industrial zones and a rewrite. No particular issue with that. The national planning standards for zones, how great is the obligation for us to comply with those if we were wanting to look at some type of fit for purpose or quite targeted zones in that industrial land space? And for example, across the water in terms of that Mount Industrial area.
So how the national planning standards are set is they provide you with a toolbox of the zones that you are to use. So for the industrial, we have light industrial, general industrial, heavy industrial, but under special purpose, there's also the port zone. So I would say that we've got a suite of 4 zones that we can use, and that would be applied across the city. But there is also the ability through the national planning standards to use precincts, and so those precincts could provide you with a site-specific bespoke response, which is what the reality is going to be for our industrial and quite likely our residential zones, that we're going to need to use those precincts to have a bespoke. So, for example, I was talking to Kapiti District Council last week. They have 50 precincts across as they've translated those national planning standards. So yeah, there is the opportunity for a bespoke approach.
No, that's helpful, but also not forgetting the city centre and whether that whole precinct approach may be applicable.
So in terms of our commercial zones, we have a full suite of zones. So that there's the most zones sit in the commercial. So there is a city centre, and it goes right through to a neighbourhood and local centre, town centre. So there is a really good suite of zones. And I think what's important is that they provide, the national planning standards provide you with the suite of zones that you must use, but the rule framework that sits behind it is actually prepared by council. So we have the ability to actually write the rules behind it. All the national planning standards do is give you the zone and a purpose statement saying generally this is what we expect this zone to look like. So in reality, what Tauranga City Council identify as a town centre zone may look completely different to council down south.
Supply and location regarding visitor accommodation. The definition of visitor accommodation, for example, does Airbnb fit into that, or is it quite separate in terms of the plan definitions?
So just to clarify, in terms of the current city plan?
Yes, and then moving forward.
So in terms of how the city plan works at the moment and how, so we've got to remember that when the plan was drafted and prepared, which was, back in 2008, Airbnb didn't exist. Book a Batch didn't exist, and so things have moved on significantly, and I think that reflects the need to review the city plan and make sure that it's responsive to what's happening on the ground. So there's really significant enforcement issues that our council are facing in terms of how you enforce Airbnbs. and book a batch, and there are some real challenges. And so at the moment, it's really hard to use the current definition and apply that to book a batch or Airbnbs. So that key issue will really be looking at that. And a really good example is down in Queenstown Lakes. They're just progressing a plan change. So we'll be again learning off other councils.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure it was on your radar, which it is.
Yes, it is. Yes.
And then in terms of urban design on page 55, 2, you talk about the urban design outcomes through the city plan, and then 3, establishing the panel. Would those 2 be, they could be separate, but they can also be connected. So I was just interested in your comments on that.
That's correct. So in those discussion documents where we have, because there's not just urban design, there's quite a few here where it actually may be a combination of responses. So that's the same as housing affordability and housing choice. It may not be just one option alone. It may be a combination of options of how council wants to proceed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Janine. I'll just follow on from Bill. I think just a couple of other questions. In terms of the industrial land, so thinking about spatial application of industrial zones and the relationship between residential zones, just wanting to make sure that that's kind of captured through the process to ensure that, you know, particularly around reverse sensitivity and those kinds of things.
Correct. So what that's the kind of the 2 key things that we're looking at. So it's about ensuring that we have enough industrial land going forward, but it's also that spatial application and the reverse sensitivity and how we are ensuring that we're creating appropriate buffers between sensitive land uses and industrial. So yes.
And just one final question. I think early on, might have been in the first month or 2 when we had an initial briefing from you guys about the city plan review. One of the issues that we raised was about getting alignment with Western Bay, and thinking about the issues and options that's kind of come through from a Tauranga City perspective, just wanting to ensure that they're aligned with whatever gets drawn through from a Western Bay perspective. We did talk about a one plan potentially, or how those things might align in terms of for a sub-regional kind of perspective when it comes to planning. Just get your thoughts on that.
Yes, so we meet with Regional Council and Western Bay on a 6-weekly basis, and that is to align our work program in terms of how we're progressing our various reviews. So, for example, Regional Council are currently considering a plan change to their regional policy statement in terms of meeting the NPS on urban development, and so things like urban limits. So we are very interested in things like that. And at our last meeting, we did discuss key issues and options. And so Western Bay in the process, they're just starting this process now. And we've agreed that once they have gone through their same process, we will identify where our key issues are the same, and that we'd look to partner and work together. So an example we've already started through smart growth is that commercial hierarchy work. We already have a smart growth resolution, and we're working together on that work. So yeah, there's I would say there's a number of key issues in here that are not TCC alone, and we'll need to work closely with Western Bay on those.
Marina, I just have one question on the cultural values section. Point number, under significant Māori areas, point number 3 states include further provisions to protect other sites of significance. So what are other sites of significance? Are they different to cultural sites of significance, or are they ones that aren't currently provided for within the city plan? So just getting a bit of clarification around that.
So when we progressed the city plan review or district plan review 10 years ago, there were a number of sites that were identified, quite a significant number of sites that were identified. And as it worked through the process, there was insufficient, or there wasn't enough information for them to be identified as significant Māori areas, but they still had cultural significance to Māori. And so what we are considering as an option is looking at where you might not have a defined site with boundaries, where there's a intact say Parsite or Urupā, but that area is of significance is there a rule framework where it's about, I suppose, recognising the cultural significance and in making sure that there is the appropriate engagement with tangata whenua in terms of development in an area. So that's when we're talking about, I suppose, other where they're not defined and can't step through and be identified as a significant Māori area. So that kind of leads into option 4, which you could actually have a policy, and we could identify general areas of significance to tangata whenua and have a policy in terms of how we engage with tangata whenua and develop a certain type or scale, I suppose, of developments happening in that area.
Kia ora, thank you.
Just out of interest, because you quickly mentioned it was referring to zonings, the different zones, and you quickly mentioned special purpose zone for the port. Through this process, that doesn't fall into any of these key areas. That won't be up for consideration or review or looking into at any stage.
So you mean the port zone?
Yes, the zone itself.
So the special purpose zones within the national planning standards are stadium zone, port zone, hospital zone, airport zone, and but we are considering, even though they sit as a special purpose zone, we're considering them as the suite of industrial zones. So the port zone will be considered as part of that wider, I suppose, group of industrial zones.
Stephen, go on.
Thank you. I guess my interest is in how we productively engage with communities, particularly on issues like urban design, because this is a very complex RMA kind of process, and the ability to control through the plan or at the other extreme through guidelines needs to be influenced and directed by the outcomes that people who live here want to see for their city. And my particular area, and I've got a bit of an issue of concern as well, is what good urban design looks like. Because in my experience in where I live in Auckland, there is new developments occurring in the city that are the inverse of good urban design, I would argue. Streets where there are no trees, areas where there are no parks, high level intensification with no car parking, yet people need cars to get around, and so the streets, berms and even parks that do exist are flooded with overflow cars because there's no allowance for vehicle parking in the residences since the government has removed that. And it is creating a kind of an urban future in Auckland that I am concerned that might end up here in Tauranga. Now, the means to control this is obviously the city plan or the various processes around urban design. But unless you have a kind of an engaged discussion with the community about what good looks like, you can end up with an Auckland situation, because Auckland went through exactly the same kind of process when they developed the unitary plan. And the pressure on Auckland is very similar to the pressure that's on Tauranga, where there's a need to deliver housing faster at a more affordable rate. And so a lot of those urban design principles get lost in that whole conversation. And I guess I want to understand how we're going to ensure that we don't end up in the same trap here in Auckland, in Tauranga I should say, because I don't think it's great for the city, and I don't actually think it's what the community of Tauranga would really wish to have. So I know it's a high level question, but I think it's a really important one.
So I think there's two quite important parts to urban design and how Tauranga City Council should be responding to urban design. You've got your public realm and you've got your private realm. So your public realm is how we design our subdivisions, so that sits with the city plan, our level of service for our parks, our berms, how we, where and how we plant trees. So that's what I call the public realm, which would eventually come into, council, but it is about how we design our, subdivisions, how we make sure we're connected, and also where we support or enable intensification. So we don't want intensification in an area that is highly isolated and not connected to your open space, your public transport, your centres. Then when you come to the what I call the private realm, it's around the design and layout of a site. So through the last city plan review, we were reasonably, well, I would say, quite silent on urban design, and proposed plan change 26 seeks to start bringing in those urban design elements in terms of how we design on site with intensification. What does that look like and how is that achieved? And through the consultation with that, there was a lot of work to be done to also take away the technical terms that we as planners use in terms of, you know, urban design, and put that into pictures and to put that into examples of when we talk about street interface, residential interface, this is what we're talking about. And so then the community can they can be on board and they can understand what we're trying to achieve through a rule that has 30% angles and setback. That actually doesn't mean anything. So that's the work that council's trying to do, and also through this consultation of these key issues and options, while the discussion documents will be at a technical level because they're kind of targeted at our key stakeholders, we're looking to have a survey where we translate it into what it means for our community. So for example, when you're talking about water efficiency, don't talk about water efficiency, you talk about water tanks, you talk about rain tanks, you talk about what the community can understand. And so that's where we will really work hard in terms of translating this technical, what you see, well, reasonably technical in attachment 1, in terms of what it means to the community, so then they can provide their feedback and what their expectations are in terms of urban design outcomes. Because it will be things like, I want to see greening of our city. That's what we hear really, quite often. I don't want to feel overlooked. I don't want to feel boxed in. I want to have, I want to have good outcomes in terms of what the facade, what the building looks like. But that's exactly what we want to hear, and then we can translate that into the technical rules.
I fear to sort of step into where planners live, which I'm not an accountant. I'm between two of them. Can I just ask a question? There are clear financial strategy implications to the development plan. When I look at something like the visitor accommodation, where you may be differing development contributions or looking at different forms of rating, when in the process do you start to try and price this and build this into your financial strategy, or rather that the financial strategy complements what you're trying to achieve through the city plan?
So I would say early on. So in terms of the purpose of this report is really just to endorse options. It's putting all the options out there. It's not saying one is better than the other, but we would need to take on board and understand what the community thinks and what their views are and what their preferred option is. But we'll need to give our committee and our commissioners a realism of what does it actually mean in terms of financial implications, social implications, environmental implications. If it goes and moves to it's a city plan option for us to progress, we need to do what we call a Section 32, and that's looking at that we've considered the issue, these are our options, and we need to do a cost-benefit analysis for economic, social, cultural, environmental. So that's when that really starts to come into play. So I would say that economic, just as much as environmental, social, is an early thinking, and we need to consider that very carefully with all those options to understand what is the best option for council to proceed with.
Very good, Janine. I've got one question. Just on the roading hierarchy, where you've got your, in the third column there, reviewing the road hierarchy to align with regional and central government strategies, is that sort of code for inclusion of cycleways and public transport requirements, etc., etc.? Where does all that come in?
Yes, it is considering things like that. So there's the one network that Waka Kotahi use. There's a number of, and at the moment our road hierarchy that sits within the plan does not align with that. So it's considering all of those different, I suppose, regional and central government plans and understanding how they need to align. And that's one thing where we'd need to work really closely with our regional council, Waka Kotahi, and also Western Bay to make sure that we're aligned in that thinking. But also it needs to be of value. So we've got to remember a plan is only as good as the rules that sit in within it. And so we need to make sure that whatever we proceed with, whatever plan, is actually linked to quality outcomes in terms of what happens on the ground. So that's what our rule framework would consider.
Kia ora, Madam Chair. Just wanted to get your thoughts around the paper that we've got. There are only those 3 issues in terms of cultural, but just to say that just to get your views in terms of the discussions that have happened at the hui that we've had around other issues that tangata whenua are raising as well. Clearly the issues, the discussion paper that you've provided in terms of housing affordability is a high issue that tangata whenua, mana whenua, our hapu and Māori land trusts are raising. I just thought some discussion around that would be cool.
So that option, the papakanga on Māori land, I think is putting a very simplistic summary of what's actually the challenges that tangata whenua are facing in terms of how they progress for development on their land. And yeah, I'd agree that housing affordability and the progression of housing on Māori land has been high on the topic, or high for discussion. And so city plan plays a reasonably small role in that. But where we've said is that we'll work with tangata whenua. So we're now going out and having one-on-one with iwi and hapu have requested. So we've got Ngāti Hangaro this week and hopefully Ngāti Kahu next week. And that's starting to look at the city plan rules may be actually okay, but what are all the other barriers that you're facing? So there's challenges in terms of stepping through the Māori Land Court. How do they get funding? The development contributions is significant for tangata whenua to enable them to start actually progressing what they can on their land, and then infrastructure. So we have traversed all of those discussions, and we will continue to, because it's definitely, every Māori land trust is slightly different. But we will work with them as much as we can. So the city plan may be only one small part of it, but there's a larger part that I suppose council can play in terms of supporting housing. And it hasn't all been housing. There has been discussion about other land uses on multiply owned Māori land or Māori land. But yeah, I suppose the conversations have been extremely bespoke and very site specific to what's happening with that iwi, that hapu, that marae.
Just the reason really for asking that question really is because several of the other items that are coming up on our agenda today actually relate to that. So we can't resolve Māori housing just by the city plan, and clearly there are other items that are coming up on our agenda. So I just wanted to make it clear that we're doing the best that we can to get the best city plan possible, but we do need support from other tools in our toolbox. Kia ora.
All right, that's a good note. Is someone prepared to move the recommendations? We received the report, endorse the options considered, and note that options to address each key issue will be included in a discussion document. Stephen? Bill? You're seconding it? Oh, right, okay. Any further discussion? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Janine. That was a pretty impressive performance. We feel it's in very capable hands. Okay, 9.3, Three Waters. Hang on.
If I can introduce that from the back here. Marina Tata.
Oh, okay.
So as the Oh, we've
Come
got
on.
it's ably covered by Stephen and Catherine,
Okay.
who are coming to
Who are coming to the
talk to it in a
table?
little bit more detail. But as the title suggests, this is just an update to the committee to inform you of the current status and the next steps for the Three Waters Reform Programme. Two components. One is the Three Waters Reform Programme as driven by DIA and central government, and the other one is the work that we are doing with other councils in what's now called the Entity Area B, which is Waikato Bay of Plenty, Taranaki, New Plymouth, 21 councils plus us, and what's happening in that area. And it is a very fast-moving initiative from week to week, so this is just a snapshot, a current status of where we're at currently. So if there are any questions, I'm ably supported by Stephen and Catherine.
Yes, and I think we need to make the point that, in fact, whilst this update was prepared, there's been a consequent meeting that Commissioner and staff attended in Taupo, and the outcome of that was to set up two committees, one technical staff representation, which I think the Chief Executive is on, and one at the political level, which the Mayor of Rotorua and the Mayor of Western Bay District Council are on, representing Bay of Plenty, and that the council is preparing public information to go out soon, which I can elaborate more on. But in the meantime, any questions for Stephen in particular? Dad?
Sorry. I just want to kind of make a observation or a question. Just in terms of your involvement.
If you like, you could move the report
I could.
and we can get it seconded and then we can have discussion.
I'll ask a question first.
Okay.
Stephen, just from your involvement within Area B, what's the general feedback from iwi Māori in Area B around Three Waters reform? Have you got a sense of where Māori are sitting? I know that you've been working quite closely with our rangapu, but thinking about all the other areas, all the other councils and across the regions, have you got a sense of where things are sitting?
Thank you for that question. I can just say that it's pretty complex when you hear the other councils, as Commissioner Selwood and I heard, and Taupo. I think it's a range of feedback that we were getting. I think local authorities need to stay close to their communities and iwi hapu partners in their area, and I think there is a feeling in some areas that the central government initiative hasn't landed as well as in others, but I think there's a strong message in there to say get close to your partners and share everything that you know at the time you receive it, and what you don't know, be upfront about it. I'll probably leave it at that if that's okay.
Catherine, there's been a fair bit of criticism floating around the sector about the numbers in the dashboard. And I picked up from the paper there was a level to which perhaps you are accepting what they say. Have we done any checking on those numbers? Do we intend on doing that, or are we accepting them?
That's right. What we've said in the paper is we haven't checked the regional numbers because they took a lot of regional data. The model assumes efficiency savings, and we've just looked at the amount of efficiency savings per year and said it seems reasonable given you've got the advantage of scale, you've got the resourcing to concentrate on things like smart metering, really investing in chasing the revenue, if you like, and understanding what's happening to that water flow. So we've really taken it from that point of view, run our numbers through the model with that sort of efficiency saving and saying, yes, that looks like a reasonable scale or quantum of saving. At the regional level, they make it, the average is slightly higher, and we're not attempting to verify their numbers.
So is someone then prepared to move that we receive the program update, recommend that we continue to support the involvement in the collaborative workshops with other local authorities in Water Entity B, and I think we want to add in a C that we communicate the reforms to our community and gain from them the issues and concerns they have about the government's reform process. Bill, you're happy to move that? And Bruce second that?
Just reiterating, it is the government reform package. That's why that wording for 3 is critical.
Yep, so communicate with our community on the government reforms and seek their concerns on the reforms. Or and seek their concerns they wish us to raise about those reforms. Issues. It's issues. So someone got that wording? Yeah.
Is that us as the committee or us as the commissioners? TCC.
TCC. TCC, rather than us. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Hoist by my own petard. Raj. Okay. So you're happy to move that, Bill? Someone second? Stephen? Oh no, Bruce seconded it. Sorry, beg your pardon. Any discussion on that? So where we are at the moment, if I elaborate on the communication that's planned to date, we're planning to put up the facts of the reform on our website. And I know the comment's already been made that not everybody goes to look at our website or spends a lot of time on our website, but it is one of the main methods of communicating. And included in that will be a list of the issues that the Commission has already identified that we want to raise with the government. That is, how do we protect from privatisation? How do we ensure that there is local input into the governance, which covers a large region? How do we ensure that our growth issues are dealt with by a committee that's probably going to be based over in Hamilton somewhere? How do we ensure that our Māori tangata whenua are included in the discussions and the issues that our rangapu raised with us about access to infrastructure in particular? And that's all I can think of so far, but those will be out on the website so people know what are the issues we're concerned about. And Then we are going to have 2 pop-up meetings where commissioners are available, one in Papamoa and one in Greerton, where people can come and ask questions of us, get a better explanation as far as we can give, because there's still not a lot of detail around the government's reforms. And then we will ascertain whether we need to do more pop-ups or more active public discussion to try and get those issues that people are concerned about. Everyone happy with that? Okay, any further discussion on that? Right, I'll put that. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Okay. Revocation of policies, item 9.4. Someone going to speak to these?
I'll speak to this one from the back benches because it's very quick,
Oh.
unless there's any questions. These are old policies that were some 20 years old, out of date, not relevant, and just as a part of our regular tidy up that we constantly do on our policy framework is suggesting these can be rescinded. Yeah, they're not utilised and not applicable anymore.
So the question I have is on the Tauranga Marina, and the issue was raised recently that the marina used to be owned by the Harbour Board. I guess it was 1989, and the Harbour Board used to have a position on the representation on the Marina Board, Governance Board. In 1989, it was handed over to, in the reforms, it was handed over to Tauranga Council, and Tauranga Council used to have representation on the boards, and that has now changed with the recent change, or the change to the constitution of the Tauranga Marina, that has no representation from Tauranga City Council on their board. And now we're proposing to get rid of the policy that sets out the council's position on the Marina Society. And the reason for that policy was to make sure they were providing affordable facilities. So my question is, if we've lost representation on the Marina Society's board and we're getting rid of the policy, we own the section of water or that it's on, we have responsibility for it. How do we ensure that that society is providing affordable facilities for boat owners?
I'll perhaps try for some of that, and some of it we may need to go away and ask the staff for dealing with more of the detail. So the council provides general water access for boat owners and parking, etc. So those are the facilities that the council provides to the general public. The marina is not a general public facility. It's effectively a purchased right, if you like, and that's what's now currently reflected in the arrangements. I don't know whether Paul can add anything in terms of the property area, but that's effectively the reality of what happens down there.
I want to signal that I'm unhappy at getting rid of the policy until we have a fuller, I mean, because it just came to our attention, Shad and I last week, the history of this. So I think before we get rid of the policy, it's been hanging around for a while, I think I would feel more comfortable if we took that out, got a bit more detail, and come back to it. Okay. Other than that, any other problems? Rahani.
Kia ora, my question's on the Māori roadways policy, and just wondering if the Rangapu or iwi and hapu are supportive of that policy being rescinded.
Yes, kia ora, thank you, Madam Chair. Just an answer your question, Rohario, is that we've never had this discussion on our agenda, and it's the first time I've heard about this, given that it was established in 1993, so that's quite an old policy. Kia ora.
And that's really why we're saying it. Some of these policies were they weren't done through a proper policy process way back. They were sort of like resolutions at a point in time that they've never really been applied. And we generally work with tangata whenua on all of these issues associated with roadways or any infrastructure on Māori land, case by case, working together to find solutions rather than something that was written in 93 that's not relevant to today's circumstances. And that's really what we're proposing that we would continue to do.
I just think I'd be more comfortable if, if the rangapu or iwi and hapu was supportive of rescinding it or having that, then be more comfortable making that decision.
We could easily refer that one across to the rangapu for their comments. If you keep in mind, what a policy is the answer to frequently asked questions. So if the question is asked infrequently, you should be dealing with it on a case-by-case basis rather than as a policy. But I think in this case, it would be helpful to get the rangapu's agreement that this is a case-by-case basis rather than a policy. Yep.
Kia ora. Not to labour the point, but I'm going to talk about Māori roadways as well. So the current Māori roadways are still being issued by the Māori Land Court, and I suppose it's just making sure that in a review or establishing a new protocol around Māori roadways, that we've taken into consideration the existing easements that already exist between Māori Land Trust, Tauranga City Council, for the provision of other services other than the road.
Okay, so I think we're looking for a recommendation that B, C, D, F, G and H be rescinded, that A be referred to the rangapu for comment, and that E, we get more information on the history and implications. Someone prepared to move that? Te Pio? Stephen second. Any further discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Item number 9.5, draft parking strategy. So Peter and Alistair coming to the table. I think what we have decided is that we will have people come to this table here to talk to us on issues rather than looking across shoulders and things, which is why I got a bit distracted. Kia ora. Do you want to make some comments on your strategy first?
Yes. So we've got Alistair Talbot here. My name is Peter Siemensma. I'm a senior transport planner here. And the purpose of today's agenda item is to provide a brief summary on the draft parking strategy and ask for approval to proceed with public consultation. Before talking through the report, I would like to emphasize that Waka Kotahi and the Regional Council have both been involved in the development of the strategy and provided some feedback. There were no major issues of major concern or disagreement. The draft parking strategy notes that parking isn't a goal on its own, but instead parking can be a lever to contribute to wider things. Vibrant centres, a multimodal transport system, a more compact urban form, prioritising for those with the greatest needs, and help to ensure value for money. The direction in the draft strategy is also supported by the NPS on urban development, the National Policy Statement, and is also aligned with Waka Kotahi's parking management guidance. Both documents strongly encourage councils to manage parking supply and demand in a consistent way, and thus developing a citywide parking strategy. And the strategy in front of us does exactly that, to provide direction on how to manage the supply and the demand of council-controlled parking spaces across the city. The city plan would deal with other items such as parking spaces in new developments or on private land. The draft parking strategy proposes a graduated parking management approach to achieve a balance between the demand and supply, as well as to encourage turnover, primarily in centres. So this may sound a bit technical. So what do we mean by a graduated approach to parking management? This is all about managing the supply and demand in such a way that there will be available spaces. An international benchmark for optimal occupancy is around the 85%. Anything higher than 85% means it's getting very hard for visitors to find a space. And trying to find a space could take a long time and leads to local congestion and things like that. On the other hand, anything much lower than the 85% means the parking management is actually too tight and spaces aren't well used. So managing parking occupancy typically means using time limits and sometimes pricing where the demand is regularly higher than the 85%. But because things do change in our city, new businesses occur, changes to parking management are required over time. Once a place gets busier, the demand for parking will grow, and incremental changes to parking management may be required. This is what we mean by a graduated parking management approach. Although managing supply and demand is a key element in the strategy, it also covers other topics such as parking on residential streets, curbside space allocation, cycle parking, prioritizing certain groups, and in specific areas, for example. The strategy recommends that the exact details for an area would be set out in a parking management plan, a PMP, and it is expected that over time a PMP would be developed for all key centres. Why area-based? Because the demand in areas can differ between different areas, and hence local consultation about a parking management plan is important. In terms of consultation, the type of organizations we've engaged with over the development of this parking strategy includes the likes of business groups, advocacy groups, local businesses and investors here in the city centre, Mount Maunganui and Greerton. Actually, the engagement with them informed the topics that the strategy addresses, including the technical notes that the strategy sometimes refers to. We've also undertaken surveys in Mount Maunganui and the city centre to understand views of visitors in these areas. We kept the key stakeholders aware of how the project progressed, and we invited them to workshops with councillors in those days and also made them aware of today's meeting. Subject to your approval, we would organise the consultation, including a workshop with our key stakeholders, an online submission form to seek feedback on the draft strategy, and that would allow us to finalise the strategy and present that to you in October or November, and then start developing the parking management plans afterwards. And I think that's roughly the parking strategy in a nutshell, and happy to take any questions.
Very much. Any questions? Bill.
Thanks, Peter. I must admit, when I was reading the document, I was probably expecting more in the draft parking strategy than what's probably there, but do appreciate that the parking management plans are the key implementation tool. However, there didn't seem to be a lot of discussion in terms of parking, its role, particularly in terms of PT, pricing, etc. So, and whilst there is an outcome around that, it was relatively general. So that's sort of one gap I felt that the document didn't probably cover off, in my view, sufficiently. The other matter was about how to deal with parking overspill from commercial areas into residential areas, and I'm thinking of the Te Papa Peninsula and everything that's going to happen in that space. And whether the view expressed was more of, particularly in that overspill situation, more from someone seeking parking than potentially those who live in all of the areas within the city adjacent to commercial areas, which will be exacerbated by the national policy statement in terms of urban development. So I was probably looking for more discussion and direction in those couple of areas. And probably my third comment was the importance of actually progressing those parking management plans once the strategy is in place. And sorry, fourth one, stakeholder engagement. And it talks about engaging with the regional council and Waka Kotahi. But I take it from the report that there hasn't been engagement with the likes of the Main Streets and others, and that won't occur until we've signed off on the draft. Is that correct, or is that assumption incorrect?
So if I can just start on the first points you made, Commissioner. So we have tried to touch on one of the outcomes around encouraging sort of more multimodal transport network. That's outcome 2. I think just reading that now, that probably could do with a little bit of extra text just to explain that dynamic between parking and encouraging alternative mode use. The second point around overspill into commercial centres.
From commercial centres.
Sorry. Again, we have tried to touch on that in some of the discussion around that 85 percentile occupancy threshold, but perhaps we could go and have another look at that and look to expand on that text just to pick that up, and I suspect probably get some reasonable feedback from some of the residents surrounding some of those commercial centres as we put the questionnaire out and ask for feedback. From stakeholders, it is probably best to advise, but I understand there has been engagement with the Tauranga Main Street, but I'll just...
Yep, that was during the development of the initial stages of the parking strategy work. So there was actually my predecessor, so it has been a while, but they would be also invited to a workshop with, as we say, key stakeholders. So there would be further consultation with them.
Throughout the city, not just in the city centre area.
Yeah, so for the strategy, we refer to it as a city-wide strategy. Specific details would indeed form part of those parking management plans, for which more detailed engagement is required, because some businesses may require, or would actually, require a much, for example, a shorter time limit, whilst others may need more long-term parking. So that's where the local engagement for the parking management plans would occur.
I think it's, I made the point in an earlier report, if we're using the term stakeholders, if you just give us some examples so that we have a clear picture of who's been involved to date and who you're then going to target.
Thank you. Just a question about, in terms of the strategy, I assume that the conversations and the engagement with the Bay Plenty Regional Council would have included, or has included, integration across their public transport strategies, and that's kind of integrated through?
Yeah, so those conversations have been with their transport and land use integration team, and the feedback has been from those people that are actually responsible for those plans and strategies.
I guess I've got a couple of questions. One is in relation to how the parking strategy fits with the city plan development. And it kind of leads on from my earlier questions around how we manage new urban developments in particular, in the provision of adequate parking for homes and visitors to homes in areas where streets are increasingly becoming narrower, the level of intensity is becoming greater, and the provision for on-site car parking is no longer required. resulting in a spillover of cars onto the local streets, often parking on berms, reducing urban amenity. So, and it relates to my second question, is have we really considered parking on local streets enough? I read the text and it says, as a result of the National Policy Statement on Urban Developments, new developments are no longer required to provide on-site car parking spaces. We understand that. This has the potential to increase demand on parking on the streets in residential areas. Well, I can tell you, this is not the potential, it will, and it will become a serious problem because people will have nowhere to park outside their home because of the clamour for parking space. So, I mean, this is from my experience, a significant issue in other centres. Queenstown experiences, Auckland experiences it, and we're starting to see it happening here in new suburban areas in Tauranga as well, where greater intensity is provided. So the strategy is going to have to deal with this problem. It's already started and it will become more significant in the future. And I just wonder whether or not we need an outcome that enables good access and amenity on local streets for parking and people visiting neighbours and friends and relatives and all of those sorts of things. Because that's one of the things we need to provide, and I think we are a significant risk. So I'm interested in your thoughts on those issues.
So we have tried to touch on those points in the strategy. Perhaps it's not clear enough given your points, and we can re-look at that. I think the strategy is there to provide a framework for those more local-based parking management plans to then test in detail. Some areas will be subject to more parking demands, some less. The strategy also includes some hierarchy in terms of how space will be allocated in certain locations, whether it's a residential street, perhaps a more commercial or something in between, and that's the terminology around sort of link in place type function in the strategy. But certainly if it's not clear enough, which it appears it isn't, then we can go in and sort of clarify that so that when those parking management plans do get developed, they've got clarity in terms of the outcomes they're looking for particular areas.
I guess that's the nub of my problem, because if there is an adequate parking provision in the city plan, then the parking management strategy is going to have to deal with that through a management plan. And the current thinking of the management plan is that you'll allow 85% kind of occupancy and encourage turnover. So does that mean that there will be enforcement on local streets when there are too many cars for the parking spaces available? I think that's what it means, right? And is that actually acceptable? Is I guess at the heart of my question.
So I suspect enforcement will be one of the tools, probably one of the leading tools. The other tools will be around, I guess, the form of the street and how it might sort of allocate space for certain uses and therefore prioritise those other uses rather than necessarily the availability for parking. So it might be that some of those streets are available and formed in a way that they provide for cycleways or for amenity space. But ultimately, if the use intended isn't eventuating, then I suspect enforcement measures, whatever they may be, would be one of the key levers to ensure the outcomes are delivered.
I'm thinking of areas in, say, Papamoa, where there's increasing intensification occurring, where I see streets going in not quite as narrow as they are in Auckland, but they're getting slimmer and slimmer as development goes on, and as pressure to increase densification in many of these suburbs increases. You have this conflict between a desire for urban intensification and a shift to public transport, walking and cycling in locations that are frankly a country mile away from employment, recreation, schools, and where communities are largely car dependent. And so you have an enormous overspill, increasing car density, increasing housing density, increases car density, increases car parking dependency. and there's a major disconnect going on. And I think we have to face up to the fact that our city planning and our parking strategy and how we deal with this has to meet the needs of our community, and I don't think we're on target right now. And the risk is going to get even greater into the future.
In fairness, I was going to say outcome 3, which is enabling a more compact urban form, is where this issue is going to be dealt with. So unfortunately, we don't have the tools. In fact, the government's taken the tools away. So we're going to have to achieve what you're asking for, we're going to have to find some other tools. And I guess that's what you're asking, whether parking management can form part of that, or a combination of the two. The parking strategy is going to come earlier than the city plan, because we're not even sure whether we're going to be able to make any city plan changes, or whether it's going to get overtaken by RMA reform, which gives us a spatial plan, which will be done on a regional basis and make it even harder to control. So I think you're asking of the parking management guys something that they probably can't deliver totally through their plan, but they can beef up the plan to actually start, because I think it's critical that the community understands the pressures that are being placed upon councils and planners across the country to deal with the issues that are being raised. And as a part-time resident of Papamoa, I can tell you, when you drive home at night, there's cars parked all over the place, on booms, on parks, you name it, there's cars parked there. So it's happening now. And I'm not sure that going and giving people parking tickets all the time is going to actually deal with that. So maybe under outcome 3, you beef that up a bit and make sure that those issues are really brought to the fore so that we can get some good community engagement on it. Is that?
Yep, I'm happy with that. I think my point is that we need to be strategic about this at all levels, and there needs to be a good, I guess, interaction between the city planning process and our parking strategy, so that we both identify and find a way to deal with this issue, because just pinging people with tickets for parking on booms or over parking where they shouldn't is not the solution. But this is where we're headed right now, and I think we need to think at a more strategic level.
Chair, and just adding a couple of comments, I'm wondering. Okay, well, I'm happy to. I'm happy to move, and as part of that, making some comments. Thank you.
Bill, seconded by Shad. Comments from Bill.
Thank you, Chair. Just a suggestion, given and picking up on the issues, whether the document, it would be helpful from the document to actually highlight some of those issues right up front, because I agree with those matters that Stephen has outlined, but also whether we actually look at, because we do still have controls, and whether we do plan changes or approve our code of infrastructure or whatever, over time streets seem to have got narrower. The opportunity to actually provide for parking has become more constrained, but whether we actually look at the wider issue in terms of our current arrangements, our current planning and our standards as part of a wider process, why this is going through its consultation, because I'm not sure whether we'll actually, if we don't do something like that, whether the issue will be resolved.
I think we're going to get into development standards here now, but that's okay. Yeah.
It's a bit of a go and then add. So We've just been through a process of the Infrastructure Development Code. So the Infrastructure Development Code is the document that defines at quite a detailed level things like street widths, street layout, where the pipes go under the ground and the distances between pipes for safety and all of those things, quite types of things. The previous IDC, the Infrastructure Development Code, was old in that it was prepared some time ago when we had greenfields development of quite low densities, well, relatively low now. And it was agreed that we needed to update that to look at delivering an urban form with a higher density and to be able to deliver the urban form and transport initiative and to get those types of urban outcomes. So there's been a comprehensive process that's been developed to do that, and that's basically completed. And it's very much trying to look at how do you create livable, walkable communities which are multimodal and higher density. And so on the one hand, it's exactly as Commissioner Selwood said, we're trying to drive much higher yield from our land so we get more efficient use of our land. There's limited land available. And also investment in transport from Waka Kotahi is predicated on being able to demonstrate that we are getting densities and that those densities are of a scale that can support particular public transport. So it is quite an interconnected web, and it's not something where you have big wide roads and lots of parking, because you're actually trying to incentivise a different type of behaviour. So that's sort of more the strategic context, and Nick might want to talk about some of the technical elements of the IDC, which sit in his group.
Yeah, so the IDC has been completed, and the mechanics of that and how you would build build a development and is covered with it's called a street design tool and street design guide. So that now gives a framework for how you would consider all of those aspects, and that's tied back into the AFTI and TSB outcomes that are sought. So it's quite a mechanical process. So it's not just up for anyone to decide how wide they would like the street in a new greenfields development. So it's regulated through the Infrastructure Development Code, which then has a tool for the implementation that's called the street design tool. And that's been developed in conjunction with the development fraternity, and they've been involved and communicated with in the rollout of that tool as well. So it's well communicated.
Well, it may well be, but it's not well communicated with people sitting around the table, I think is the message. So we might want to just have a look at that and make sure that we are not setting ourselves up for, it may be perfectly fine, but I think the message that I'm getting is that we do want to have a look at that and see what that's like, and whether the parking strategy is going to, whether we're going to have to be asking of the parking strategy something that should actually be embedded somewhere else. I think really is the conclusion we've come to, rather than berate the parking strategy people.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. So the IDC, the city plan, and the intensification that we're trying to achieve is delivering exactly the situation, Stephen, that you're describing out in the cul-de-sacs off the cul-de-sac of Papamau. And some of those streets are very, very narrow and only allow for one off-street car for each property, and generally each property has at least 2 cars. So the only place for them to park is on the very, very narrow berms of the narrow cul-de-sacs or streets. And so my sense is that the IDC is trying to deliver on that intensification to meet the intensity, but it is delivering that suboptimal outcome where cars are parking all over the place. So revisiting the IDC, I guess, is the only tool that we have at this stage.
I don't think it is. I think the IDC is trying to meet the demands, as you're saying. So I think it is more of a strategy or policy issue here that we need to decide how big a part the car plays in the future of Tauranga. And you know, that's there's a bigger picture to be talked about here, and I think it's. I mean, we started out talking about or Peter started out talking about the parking strategy being not just a strategy for parking, but also being a transport lever. And the parking strategy is one of those levers that can, give people a better opportunity to hop on public transport, for instance. And so how do you pitch an attractive service against the cost of parking, for instance, and that's a balance that we haven't got yet, and I don't, it's not something that infrastructure or regulation can necessarily resolve. I think it needs to be driven at, policy strategy in the policy strategy sphere.
I think too there will be some market drivers, so while the district plan can't require car parking in residential areas, the developers will still deliver to some extent to the demands of the purchaser, and while there is a focus on affordable housing, there will also be people who will be looking for two-vehicle garaging, etc. So that will still drive to some extent until you get longer-term behavioural change. And if you look over at the Mount, where there have been car parks provided as part of the dwelling, many of them have been converted to an extra bedroom, etc. over time, so you can require it as part of your city plan, but actually ensuring that happens over the longevity of the building's life cycle is not a straightforward thing as well. So it's a very complex equation.
It is, and we're trying to achieve a behaviour change in a very short period of time for people who have quite complex lives. And buses, regardless, are not going to go down every little cul-de-sac. So even if you put in good public transport with park and rides, people have got to be able to get to the place where they're going to park, to get on, to ride into wherever they're wanting to go. So it is very complex, and we're being shoehorned into trying to make those changes overnight ahead of where the population is. So the more conversations we can have about what those drivers are, climate change being one of the greatest, but also the regulations under which we're operating, the better. So that's why it has to be quite front and centre in the conversations about your parking strategy, because that is one of the tools that we have in the toolbox. But another tool is the IDC or whatever it is. And I think the message was we'd like to have a look at it. Fair enough? Okay, it's nearly lunchtime, starting to get hangry. No, I'm not. But I think we've got the parking strategy in front of us. Let's deal with that, and we can come back to the wider issues in another forum at another time. Christine? And then
At the moment, you've got a resolution on the table that says to adopt the parking strategy, but you've also given us some direction through here to emphasise certain points more robustly. So can I maybe suggest you might just want to modify the motion that's on the tables to require staff to emphasise points, and we can just drive those into a couple of bullet points for the minutes, just so it's complete.
The mover add in as amended.
And picking up that the suggestion of having that issues section at the front end, so we're actually getting some discussion and debate of then what is driving a whole range of other things, including the parking strategy.
So that's, as long as the committee understands that's the amendments that we're talking about. So Te Pio, come to.
Yeah, kia ora. I just wanted to raise the issue of event parking around marae. So we have 4 urban marae, and the marae that I'm actually more concerned about are Ahuria and Mangatapu. Is that growth and development have encompassed those marae. They have no area or land available or limited land available for parking for tangihanga. And I think if you saw the size of Uncle Kihi's tangihanga at Wharero, they were lucky to have the area that they have around their marae. But, you know, for the pokai that is held every year, huria are going to be a consistent venue for the pokai. And for tangihanga that they have at huria, this is going to be an issue for them and their residents. We just talked around parking spilling over and into those other areas. That definitely happens for those marae in particular. Just raising that for the team.
Right, with all those noted, and the recommendation then is we receive the draft parking strategy report and we approve it as amended for public consultation, and that recommendation will then go through to council. So I assume when you come to council you will have tidied up those points that we've raised.
If I may, I think the proposal was to respond to the feedback we've got and then hopefully go to public consultation, which is essentially a sort of a questionnaire type approach, and then once we have that feedback, bring it back to yourselves for a decision in perhaps October.
Yes, but this committee makes recommendations through to council, so I'm just questioning whether by the time it gets to council, which won't be next week, but the following council meeting, or does it come next week?
We weren't thinking it.
Oh,
because
okay.
it's not a statutory document,
Right,
we didn't think it needed to be approved by council, and it's a draft, but I mean, that's obviously at your discretion, so we were trying to work at pace, particularly because this leads the parking management plans, and we're working on the parking management plan to have them complete by February to enable you to make your decisions about the city centre before you change your parking pricing in the city centre. But it's absolutely at your discretion. If you want us to come back, we're happy to do so.
I'm happy. I think we've given a reasonable amount of direction today for staff to go away, make those amendments, undertake the consultation, and then come back. More than happy with that.
Second, happy? Okay. All right. Sorry, I misunderstood. Okay, so all those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We're now going to break for lunch. We will be back at 1:30. 1:30? Yeah. Resume at 1:30.